Chapter 3 covers a really huge topic of population geography or geodemographics, and I'm going to do this again in two parts. The first concept is just this understanding of distribution of people. We want to know where people are living. Are they clustered? Are they dispersed? And so we can look at some demographic indicators or some demographic statistics of population to better understand how and where people are living. So we can look at total population or population density. So total population would just be raw numbers. The density would be the number of people in a given spatial area. We also look at some indicators of birth rate, death rate, infant mortality rates. We look at gender balance, and then we look at age balance. And all of these really have an impact on how a society is functioning. So when we look at population density, there's a bit of a myth that high dense places relate strongly to the quality of life. And so the idea is that if people live in a very densely populated area, they have a poor quality of life. In some places that's true, but that's really not true across the board. So we can look at the population density centers, so where there are more people per square kilometer according to this map, and you can see that there are several very dense places in the world, Bangladesh, India being one. This entire Asian peninsula is very densely populated. Papua New Guinea is very sparsely populated, and you can look at these little population clusters in the United States and many in Europe. So there are very high dense places, there are very low dense places, and the places that are the least dense tend to be related to physical environment as well. So where there is a lot of desert, as in the Sahara, where there is very dense jungle, as in Brazil, desert in Australia. And as we'll find out at the end of the term, the population is becoming more and more urbanized, so these densities are becoming larger. We can also just look at trends in population growth. So in 2010, China had the largest population, and the US was the third most populated country in the world. And if we predict these numbers into 2050, we'll see that the United States stays as the third most populated country. India and China switch places, but you begin to see other countries moving up into the top 6. And so then the book talks a little bit about carrying capacity, and that's the ability for the land to support the population. And then we begin to think about, can the U.S. exist beyond its carrying capacity? What other countries maybe have reached their carrying capacity? And then this idea of globalization. So we are no longer dependent on U.S. soil and U.S. territory to support all our needs. We go elsewhere to get the things that we need and want. The book also has you look at two different theories. I want you to be able to differentiate between Malthusian and cornucopian, and that's pretty easily explained in the book, so I won't go into that. So then when we start to look then from just numbers of population, and we want to be able to compare how places are from one to the other, we need to be able to do some kind of normalizing or some way to compare apples and apples. And so we do this by looking at the rates, so birth rate, death rate, the rate of infant mortality, and usually these are a number per 1,000 people. So a birth rate of 5 would mean that for every 1,000 people there are 5 people born a year. The death rate would be for every, if a death rate were 5, the death rate would be for every 1,000 of the population, 5 people die. So this is a way that you can kind of control and compare countries with large populations to countries with small populations. So we can break these down into mortality and natality. So the natality, or kind of the birth-related indicators that we often compare, are birth rate and the total fertility rate. So the total fertility rate indicates how many, what is the average number of children a woman will have in her reproductive years. And if a country has a total fertility rate of 2.1, it means that that country is at zero growth. If it has a higher fertility rate, it means that the country is probably expanding, and if it has a lower fertility rate, it means that the country is not at replacement. And so it's important to know that the U.S. fertility rate, I'm looking at page 58 here, the U.S. has a fertility rate in some places of under 2.1, so that means that the population in those areas is in a decline just from births, and in some places we have a fertility rate of up to 3. But if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, some places the fertility rate is 6 and over, which means that that is an expanding population. Let's move down here. So here is a different map than the one in your textbook. I don't know if it has birth rate. Actually, I think I put birth rate and death rate maps on Moodle for you. But this is a birth rate map, and it really does kind of parallel with fertility rate. If you look at the fertility rate in the textbook, sub-Saharan Africa has birth rate, so 35 people are born, or 35 babies are born for every 1,000, and in the U.S. we have a birth rate of below 10. And so you can also begin to think about countries that are more developed have a lower birth rate. Countries that are less developed have higher birth rates. Sometimes this is also called the crude birth rate, or just birth rate. And I think, let me go back to this one. Oh, it doesn't show the year for this. So here's another map just showing, this is a little bit older. That's right, this is a 10-year older map. And so the birth rates were higher in sub-Saharan Africa and in the U.S., and so we have had declining birth rates over time. And so the birth rate is very strongly influenced by several other demographic factors. It can be influenced by the gender. So if you have a lot of women, a lot of men, how that works out. You can, if you have an older population, you're probably going to have a lower birth rate. And also customs and family size expectations, so cultural norms. And then birth rate can really be affected by political policies, and we'll look at a couple of those in the text related to China and India. When we look at mortality, we can look at crude death rate, and the crude death rate is how many people die per 1,000, and we begin to see a difference in death rate causes between the developed and the developing world. In the developing world, death rates are as a result of infectious diseases, nutritional problems, and sanitation. In the developed world, the death rates are a result of lifestyle, so smoking, cancer rates. And in some countries, the crude death rate is higher in countries that are more developed than in countries that are developing, just because of lifestyle changes. The infant mortality rate is the number of children who live to the age of 5 per 1,000 births. So if you have an infant mortality rate of 5, that means 5 out of every 1,000 births children do not live to the age of 5. And this is a great indicator for standard of living. We talked in chapter 1 that the HDI was also a good indicator of standard of living. The infant mortality rate is much better, and we'll take a look at some of the reasons for that. This is the crude birth rate, or the crude death rate. And again, you can see sub-Saharan Africa still has a much higher crude death rate than other countries in the world. But Mexico has a lower crude death rate than the United States and Canada. And again, this is probably directly related to lifestyle differences in the U.S. and Canada as opposed to Mexico. This map shows the infant mortality rate for 1990, and you can see there are countries here in the bright red where there are greater than 200 deaths per 1,000 infants born, and that's their chance of dying by age 5. And so again, sub-Saharan Africa seems to really ring the alarm bells on all of these demographic indicators. However, the United States does not have, did not have in 90, the lowest infant mortality rates when we look at comparisons with Canada and Europe. And I think I have a more current map. So the infant mortality rates in the U.S. have declined, and in fact they've declined across the world, but they're still very high, and I don't see any on this map that fit this over 200, but still many in the up to 100 to 199 deaths per 1,000 children. And so you really begin, when you look at these indicators, you begin to get this global sense of a very uneven world development. So I'm going to just click back to birth rate. Lower birth rates, higher birth rates around the equator. Death rate, and this is a little bit of a switch, because you begin to see these equatorial regions, these Middle Eastern regions, as having lower death rates than some of the more developed countries. And then we can look at infant mortality rate. And so the World Health Organization gathers, I think that's where I got most of these maps. They do a lot of kind of global demographics. And so they were looking at the sub-Saharan Africa region, where they were having just exceedingly high deaths per live births, and apparently some areas 6 times as high as places in Europe. And so when we began to think about migration and people needing to move, this really has an impact when people want to find a safer place to live. So when their own environment begins to be less desirable, that push to find a better place is really what instigates a lot of voluntary migration and movement of people. The last demographic indicator I want to talk about that's new to you is the total fertility rate. I think I talked about that a little bit. And so this is a map again showing total fertility rate, so the average number of children a woman will have in her reproductive years. And again, you see a very dichotomous split in the world. And one of the things to remember is that fertility rate is very difficult to change, because people begin to think of small family size as culturally normal or preferred, or large family size as culturally normal and preferred. And so this is especially played out in China right now, where major political sanctions against having more than one child are being lifted, and yet culturally it is now normal to only have one child, and that is considered by many a preferred lifestyle. And so it's very hard to move from having more than one. However, it is going to be really important for people in China to think about larger family size, just to support the economy and the aging family structure, the aging population structure. So I found this map, which really has nothing to do with anything that we're doing right now, but I thought it was fascinating, looking at the world in terms of required seatbelts for children, or child restraints. And so the World Health Organization, if you Google this, they have just amazing number of maps, very interesting maps. And so you can see that in the red, these are the countries that have no seatbelt laws for children at all. The green countries have a national seatbelt law. And then the black countries, seatbelt laws change as you go across the country from region to region. And this is, we're going to look at this option, or the result, or the cause of this, when we talk about political geography, because this is really related to how the governments are structured, whether it's a unitary government or a federal government. And so it was just in here to show what other kinds of things the World Health Organization does as far as demographics. And then finally, for this part, or not finally, I have one more slide after this. So in the first chapter, we looked at the Human Development Index, and that's on page 12. And it's really, I think, important for you to look at the spatial pattern. How does this Human Development Index change? Where is it high? Where is it low? And how does that compare to the total fertility rate, the infant mortality rate, the birth rate, the death rate? And so when you want to get a global picture and try to understand how countries are doing, you really need to be able to look at all of these indicators. So as we said over and over, the HDI is a good indicator of the standard of living. Oh, it is not a liver expectancy. It is a, autocorrect is a pain. Life expectancy, education, and wealth and literacy. So it's a composite indicator of all these things. However, the infant mortality rate is generally accepted to be, if you can pick one indicator of a country to kind of get a snapshot of how it's doing, the infant mortality rate is considered the best for several reasons. One, it encompasses so many other demographics. So if you can just imagine, we're talking about, out of the number of children that are born, out of 1,000 children, how many live to age 5? And so this would include things like just general health of the country, nutrition, sanitation, medical availability, housing. So there's so many things that go into having healthy children and sustaining those lives, that infant mortality is the best single indicator. And then the last part for this section of the chapter is being able to look at government sanctioned population control. And the book talks a lot about China and India. There are several readings this week looking at some of the problems in China as population one-child policies were instigated, and the effect that they've had on number of women that are available to marry, on bringing in women from other countries for because there aren't enough women to marry, women migrating into the city for better jobs, and the whole infrastructure of supporting the elderly. So all of these things have really been upset by the long time population control. And so right now, the total fertility rate for China is 1.7, which is not replacement. When the population rules or the population controls were set up, it was at about a 5.9, which is high growth. Okay, so I'm going to stop this first part, and the second part is will take you into looking at the demographic transition model, understanding population pyramids.